Next. Conrad, I need maybe proud to be a moderator for the first time in such an international conference. So please, you know, cross with me. And the three panelists we have in this session. The first one is JoAnn Conrad from Diablo Valley College, Pleasant Hill in California, in USA. And JoAnn is going to present, yes, JoAnn is a professor of history and cultural history and folklore. And I asked JoAnn to tell something about her, what she's interested in. So she said she's troll, so I can introduce her as a great trollologist. Not troll, but troll. Okay, yours. Good, JoAnn.
Okay, thank you. I want to say Bettina started the conference out today by saying this is a specifically European enterprise. And in all honesty, my paper had started out with European material, German material, Italian material, and it became so huge that now by default, as we Americans do, this became an American topic, but or at least my data. But I hope that you see the reasoning that I'm coming at with this. So I can start. In 1933, when she was 16 years old, my mother created an image she entitled "The Last Man on Earth," in which a man in his motor car is driving up the single road towards his house, while the rest of humanity, aloft in their various flying machines, look down on him. What was it about aviation that had captivated her as a girl? Yes, as a girl. She's a little bit older than the girl there. And why did she envision and depict the future of flight, and indeed the future, in such a distinctive way? Clearly, at least in part derivative of and inspired by images in popular culture, I wondered why it was that aviation not only occupied her thoughts, but her creative engagement. In this paper, I used my mother's images, this image, and early 20th century popular imagery to discuss the changing boundary between the fictions and realities of human flight and the ways in which imagery served to mediate, translate, and eventually normalize the science and fantasy of flights. Images of flight also give a glimpse into how people in the new 20th century envisioned the future and how those visions reflected and were shaped by various ideological discourses of the day. Flight, breaking our terrestrial bounds, has long been a source of human fascination, the fantasy becoming more proximate or at least imaginable with the invention of the telescope and Newtonian physics in the 17th century. Early fantastical literature of human flight did little to differentiate between space flight and what would later be known as aviation. Much of the imagery featured flights to the moon, or the man in the moon, or the men in the moon. And all of these images continued to circulate as the science of flight and later space travel progressed. But by the early 19th century, accelerated technological advances in aviation and proto-science fiction related to flight began their symbiotic relationship. This was played out in new forms new fields of commercial art and advertisement, and demanded by a voracious reading public. Illustrated magazines not only offered up eye appeal to consumers, but the publishing strategy was built on providing a mix of genres. That is, articles of fiction and science appeared alongside one another in each issue, and this material proximity allowed for the mutual exchange of influence between science and fiction, fantasy and reality. The mutual influences of science and fiction are obvious, the fantasy often anticipating the science. Did I get there? This is all newspapers there. The science anticipating the fiction anticipating the science, while real life events loop back into fiction. So here, Pinocchio reads about the Wright brothers and asks his father for an airplane. Mickey Mouse reads about the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh and wants to imitate him by making and flying a plane in the 1928 Disney animated short Plane Crazy, which became the impetus for a comic strip, a syndicated comic strip launched in 1930. But just as clear is the way in which fantasy images circulated, recirculated, and morphed through various media and different genres. Around 1900 is a turning point, I think. Around the turn of the century, as flight became technologically viable and yet still protean in execution, images of near-future aviation saturated the public purview in new mediated forms and advertising. Flight was imagined as an individual pursuit, with futuristic planes often resembling cars. One pilot noting in 1910 that, quote, an airplane is as easy to drive as an automobile. In all other ways, though, in clothing, architecture, and activities, these images reflected the contemporary landscape. Planes might replace existing forms of transportation, but not fundamentally change society. Projecting into a more distant future, an article in another magazine from July 1922, the American Weekly magazine, confidently predicted that in 2022, quote, no man will be without his own airplane, unquote. Still, while the architecture is futuristic, flight was still imagined as a personal mode of transportation. It was still inconceivable that planes could replace trains in transporting passengers, goods, or mail. So with the attention focused on aviation for the time being, narratives of spaceflight and travel receded into the background, returning later with a vengeance. So decoupled, aviation has its own literature that develops. I'd been looking for what might have been the visual surround in the late 1920s and early 1930s that could have contributed to my mother's imagining of the future of flight, but also for visual evidence that popular cultural forms introduced technological change in familiar, accessible terms to gradually normalize such new concepts as mechanized flight, electricity, and communication systems, introducing modern wonders by presenting them in familiar tropes of magic and fairy tale language. This is what I found. So there's a bunch of these. Children's picture books at this time seemed to present fantasies of flight in nostalgic retrograde assemblages with scant reference to science. Their irrationality, that is, their complete disengagement from any claim on science is emphasized by their being the stuff of dreams. In L. Frank Baum's Wonderful Wizard of Oz, lots of things, this is from 1900, lots of things fly, right? Houses, monkeys, witches, but the balloon is an 18th century technology that transports the wizard back to Kansas from Oz, and it looks at a past, not future technology to do it. Baum clearly played with the movement from reality to fantasy, but not with the intersection of science and fantasy. Other material, including, this is for you, Elena, other material, including advertising, seems to underscore the incomprehensibility of new technologies with mixed metaphors of radio technology, electricity, space travel, and flight, randomly combined without reference to any parallel technology. Reframed in fairy tale scenarios, these invisible and therefore magical, or at least mysterious, forces are, however, symbols of the new century of progress and technology's central role in it. And in that sense, they are normalizing that technology. Books like this one, 1922, the previous one, Man in the Moon, told over the radio phone, or this Swedish book about Little Bjorn and his radio journey to the stars, in which he is helped by a group of anthropomorphized radio tubes that help him travel to a fairy tale land where, quote, all the old fairy tale creatures have gone. That's just mixed. In general, however, although picture books targeting young children included images that alluded to aviation, these were incorporated into an already existing fantasy scenario with little reference to either reality or science of flight. This was not the case for YA material, which emphasized flight technology and its potential for adventure with colonial, militaristic, and masculinist overtones. These themes were the favorite of the new forms of mass-produced media, cheap weekly magazines, such as the Frank Reed Weekly Magazine, and pulp fiction, such as that provided by the Stratemeyer Syndicate, the juvenile fiction publisher derided by educators and loved by readers. Beginning in 1899 with his first series, Stratemeyer revolutionized the juvenile publishing industry by flooding the market using all the techniques of mass production. His books were widely distributed and wildly popular, resulting in over 1,200 series books in 125 different series. And visually, the cover art was there to really sell the product. 1910 marked the beginning of the Tom Swift series, The Adventures of the Eponymous Child Inventor, and of the 40 different Tom Swift books in the so-called original series, 1910 to 1941, at least 12 are related to aviation. Tom Swift was the embodiment of, so there's Tom Swift. Tom Swift was the embodiment of the trope of the young inventor who introduced new and untried technologies and reflected the utopian attitude towards science that characterized the progressive era. These were the texts of modern American boyhood. And in this pre-World War I utopian vision of the future, more boys' aviation series would be added, like these guys. The masculinist theme that undergirded these texts intensified during World War I, overlain with militarism and violence. These themes were echoed, here's a little bit, there's a lot to this that I can't get into, but these themes were echoed in children's material from Germany, of course, where they were developing their own aviation science. And in particular to the prolific work of Hans Dominic, who combined science with science fiction, writing scientific fairy tales, but also specifically non-fictional how-to material in popular science magazines. One piece that defined the visual landscape of the U.S., one final piece that defined the visual landscape of the U.S. before World War I, the period in which my mother was born, was the emergence of syndicated comic strips. And it's arguable that both the pulp fiction of the Stratemeyer series and comics, two of the most derided subjects for librarians and educators with their massive output and distribution, were the media through which images of flight were populated for that generation. Comic artist Winsor McCay, whose comic strips continue to influence the form, heavily relied on images of flight in his fantasy dreamscapes. McCay, like his contemporary Baum, started in visual advertising and understood the use of color in creating fantastic landscapes of desire, as did the major newspaper syndicates of the time. His syndicated full-page weekly color comic, Little Nemo in Slumberland, ran from 1905 to 1911, and then again from 1924 to 27, at a time when not only newspaper readership was exploding, but when publishers understood the power of such color visuals to drive newspaper sales. For consumers, this is really important, reading the Sunday comics, the funny papers, was a highly anticipated weekly ritual, and engagement was visceral, tangible, as well as visual. And a different tangibility than with books, right? Such comic strip images, especially popular and widely distributed comics like McCay's, were incorporated in a new popular visual idiom, a new modern way of seeing. To McCay, the conventional frames of the comic strip were a challenge rather than a limitation. His juxtaposition of individual frame sizes with partial images seemingly cut off at the edge suggests movement and motion. Similarly, adjacent frames of the same object with changing relative proportions offer shifting points of view. His aerial views signal not only the contemporary public fascination with aviation, but also the anticipation of the view of Earth from space that would only be realized by the astronauts during the space race. Finally, his blending of text and images to create a hybrid and brand new form anticipates what Christine Hallberg has in the context of picture books labeled iconotext. My mom's image reflects some of McKay's comic style. Her planes and blimps are abruptly cut off at the paper's edge, suggesting more frames to follow, that there's more to the story. The semi-planar view of the Earth seen from above and yet simultaneously at the level of and opposite to the parade of planes is a view accessible only in illustration, a view that makes sense not because it reflects any kind of physical reality, but because it is one that has been imagined before by McKay. My mom had internalized all of this because it had been mediated and normalized during her 16 years. She was drawing things that she knew only through their popular mass-mediated forms, and in the process, she had learned the conventions of a new visual genre. But her drawing also reflects real changes effected by technological advances and responses to them. If you look, there's a traffic light, and a traffic cop surveys the scene, all reflecting the realities that resulted from the increased use of cars in the first decades of the 20th century that required traffic laws. Traffic lights were such a new phenomenon that my mom's image does not reflect the now standard green, yellow, red configuration. But by 1933, my mom's image does suggest the expectation of order in car traffic that she transfers, by analogy, to her traffic scene above the Earth, in which all the vehicles are flying in the same direction. My mother's image also shows the influence of other comics and mediated forms from the 1920s to 30s. The traffic light, oh, thank you. The traffic light, the traffic cop, the anachronistic 1920s style open touring car, the tires, the exhaust puffs out behind the car, they're all conventionalized visual tropes developed in the comics, as seen in Disney stuff and in of Iwerks, who was working with Disney in the early years. After victory in World War I, a booming consumerist economy in the US, a surplus of pilots and planes, and a zeitgeist of individualism, optimism, and a belief in progress, and a belief came together in this golden age of aviation. Exemplified in and amplified by the surge in air races, flying circuses, barn burners, aerial daredevils, and other mostly male heroes, culminating in Lindbergh's flight. These spectacles galvanized an American public already interested in aviation and spun off a host of related cultural phenomena, thrusting aviation even more to the center of American consciousness, which was then amplified by children's material. Disney specifically calls out Lindbergh in comics and animated shorts. The Stratemeyer's Tom Swift series continues into the 30s with a lot of books about aviation, while taking on more globally expansive colonialist and racist aspects. Stratemeyer expanded into other specifically aviation-themed series, especially motivated by Lindbergh's flight, with the Ted Scott flying series, and this kind of series proliferated further with other secondary publishers. Lots and lots of aviation books. The market, this is cool, the market expanded to include trading cards of famous aviators in chewing gum packets that you would collect, right? And also would model airplanes. So your boy might be greater than Lindbergh. And these model airplanes then had their own subscription magazines. Aviation was linked to a sense of Americanness that was all about speed, power, and masculinity. And this would have been the visual world of my mother's experience. And yet her image reflects none of the aggressive individualism of the male-centered popular media, nor does it seem particularly celebratory or optimistic. Nonetheless, her image is, her image is in dialogue with those male-centered forms. This story ends in 1933 with my 16-year-old mom about to embark on her own future. During World War I, a child of the 20s and the Great Depression, raised by a single working mother, her future could not have been certain. The high-flying days of the Roaring 20s were over, and yet in her image, flappers, aviators, and fat cats fly above, apparently going nowhere, blissfully unaware of the brewing storm. The market had crashed. There was a Great Depression. 8 days after she finished the image, Hitler became chancellor, and within 6 years, the Luftwaffe would begin aerial bombing of Poland. FDR had not yet been inaugurated, and the New Deal was still months away. The prediction that aviation would bring about a utopia of endless peace had failed. And what my mother's vision, stripped of militarism and progressive optimism, is instead, is the dystopian vision of a child who is on her own in the world. And yet the image and the ways in which she incorporated and adapted the newly invented conventions of comics and animation speak to her interpolation into that new world, identified in large part by visual media. That's it.